Before he became a headline, John Robert McCabe was just a kid trying to figure out high school. He wasn't the star quarterback, wasn't class president or voted most likely to succeed. He was somewhere in the middle, the place where most of us actually live. He had friends but wasn't the center of attention. Got decent grades without being a genius. Liked music. Played pickup basketball at the park on weekends. Talked about maybe joining the army after graduation, though his mom hated that idea. He was born in Tewksbury on March 3, 1954, middle child. His older brother, Daniel, was already working construction by 1969. His younger sister, Margaret, was 12 and thought John was the coolest person alive, even though he mostly ignored her. Their father, Robert McCabe Sr., worked at a textile mill in Lowell. Swing shifts, long hours, the kind of job that paid the bills but didn't leave much left over. Their mother, Patricia, stayed home with the kids when they were young, then started working part-time at a bakery once Margaret started school. They weren't rich, but they weren't struggling either. Solid working class, the kind of family that saved up for a week at the beach in the summer and considered it a vacation. John's bedroom was small. Posters on the wall, bands his parents didn't understand. A transistor radio he'd saved up for, always tuned to WRKO out of Boston. A stack of comic books under his bed. A baseball glove that hadn't been used in 2 years but he couldn't bring himself to throw out. He'd just started his sophomore year at Tewksbury Memorial High School. Classes were fine. Algebra was kicking his ass. English was easy. History was boring, unless Mr. Callahan was telling war stories, which he did more often than teaching the actual curriculum. John had a part-time job bagging groceries at the Stop and Shop on Main Street, 3 afternoons a week and Saturday mornings, $1.30 an hour. He was saving up for a car, though he was still a year away from his license and hadn't told his parents yet because he knew his dad would say they couldn't afford the insurance. His best friend was a kid named Michael Gibbons. They'd known each other since 3rd grade, played basketball together, shared cigarettes behind the gym when they could swipe them from Michael's older brother, talked about girls they were too nervous to actually approach. Michael was supposed to meet John at the dance that night. He never showed up. Got grounded the day before for coming home late. Spent that Saturday night in his room, listening to the radio, wishing he was anywhere else. He'd carry that guilt for the rest of his life. The last confirmed sighting of John alive was at 7:52 p.m. Mrs. Eleanor Haverhill, a neighbor 3 houses down, saw him walking along Whipple Road toward the center of town. She was watering her front garden. Waved. John waved back. She'd remember later that he seemed happy, normal, not scared, not running. Just a kid heading out for the night. At 8:10 p.m., a clerk at Richie's convenience store on Main Street told police she thought she saw John come in to buy a soda, but she couldn't be certain. The store was busy. Lots of kids in and out that night. After that, nothing solid. The dance at the YMCA started at 8:30 p.m. More than 60 teenagers showed up. Local DJ. Folding tables with punch and cookies. Chaperones standing along the walls making sure nobody got too close during the slow songs. John never walked through the door. Nobody at the dance remembered seeing him. Not outside. Not in the parking lot. Not anywhere. Somewhere between his house and the YMCA, a walk that should have taken 20 minutes, John Robert McCabe vanished. His family would spend decades replaying that night. What if his mom had driven him instead of letting him walk? What if his dad had been home instead of working a double shift? What if Michael hadn't been grounded and they'd gone together? What if John had just stayed home? But you can't rewind time. You can't undo the choices that seemed harmless in the moment. You can't unopen the door. John wanted to go to a dance, wanted to see his friends, maybe work up the courage to talk to Janet Kozlowski, maybe just feel normal for a few hours on a Saturday night. There was nothing reckless about that. Nothing stupid. Nothing that should have cost him his life. He was 15 years old. He should have come home that night with sore feet from dancing and a story to tell at breakfast. Instead, his parents got a knock on the door from 2 detectives who could barely get the words out. In the days after his death, the high school held a memorial assembly. The gym was packed. Teachers cried. Students held hands. The principal spoke about loss and community and staying strong. But nobody had answers. Nobody knew why. And that absence, that gaping, aching hole, where an explanation should have been, would haunt Tewksbury for decades. John Robert McCabe wasn't just a victim. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a kid who liked music and hated algebra, and dreamed about driving a car someday. He mattered. And what happened to him that night mattered, even if it would take 40 years to prove it. Detective Raymond Thornton had worked homicides before, but nothing like this. Bar fights gone wrong, those made sense. Domestic violence that escalated, tragic, but understandable. Even armed robberies that turned deadly followed a certain logic. But a 15-year-old kid bound, gagged, and strangled, left in a vacant lot like trash? That was something else. That was personal. Rage. Or calculation. Maybe both. Thornton set up shop in a cramped office at Tewksbury Police Headquarters. Map of the town pinned to the wall. Red string connecting locations. John's house. The YMCA. The vacant lot on Dover Street. Everywhere in between. The first 48 hours were critical. Everyone knew that. After 2 days, memories fade. Witnesses second-guess themselves. Evidence degrades. Thornton and his team moved fast. The timeline problem. John left his house at 7:30 p.m. Confirmed. Seen by a neighbor at 7:52 p.m. walking toward Main Street. Confirmed. Possibly spotted at Richie's convenience store around 8:10 p.m. Unconfirmed. After that, nothing. The YMCA was a straight shot from John's house down Whipple Road, left on Main Street, another 10 minutes on foot. He should have arrived by 8:15 p.m., at the latest, but he never got there. So what happened in those missing minutes? Detectives canvassed every house, every business, every person who might have been out that night. They interviewed the store clerk at Richie's 3 separate times. She kept changing her story. First, she was sure it was John. Then she wasn't. Then she thought maybe it was him, but couldn't swear to it. Not helpful. A man named Gerald Foss told police he saw a scuffle near the intersection of Main and Foster around 8 p.m. 2 people, maybe 3, near a parked car. But it was dark. He was driving. Didn't get a good look. Didn't think much of it at the time. Probably just kids messing around, he'd said. Now he wasn't so sure. Detectives pressed him for details. What kind of car? What color? Did you see faces? Hear voices? Foss couldn't remember, or didn't want to. He seemed nervous, kept saying he wished he'd paid more attention. They brought him back in twice more, showed him pictures of cars, asked him to walk them through it again. But the more they pushed, the less confident he became. Eventually, they had to let it go. Maybe he saw something, maybe he didn't. The forensics. This was 1,969. No DNA testing, no digital fingerprint databases, no surveillance cameras, no cell phone records. What they had was what they could see, touch, and photograph. The rope used to bind John's wrists and ankles was standard clothesline available at any hardware store in the state. No serial numbers, no unique markers. The duct tape across his mouth was a common brand, sold everywhere. The ligature marks on his neck suggested he'd been strangled with something smooth, maybe a belt, maybe another piece of rope. But whatever was used, the killer took it with them. No fingerprints on John's clothing, no fibers that didn't belong. The rain 2 days earlier had washed away any tire tracks or footprints at the dump site that might have been useful. The autopsy confirmed what everyone already knew. Cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation. Time of death estimated between 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. No signs of sexual assault. No defensive wounds on his hands. His knuckles weren't bruised. No skin under his fingernails, which meant he probably didn't fight back. Or couldn't. Thornton's theory. John was ambushed, overpowered quickly, maybe grabbed from behind, restrained before he had a chance to resist. That required strength, planning, control. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was deliberate. Within the first week, detectives interviewed over 100 people, teachers, classmates, neighbors, store owners, anyone who knew John or might have seen him that night. They built a list of persons of interest. Not suspects, not yet, but people who warranted a closer look. Leonard Marsh, 43, lived 2 blocks from the vacant lot. Prior arrests for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. Worked odd jobs, kept to himself. Neighbors described him as strange and off-putting. Police brought him in for questioning. He had no alibi for the night John died, said he was home alone, but there was no physical evidence tying him to the scene. They searched his house, found nothing. Let him go, but kept him on the list. David Kaczynski, 19, had recently been released from juvenile detention for assault. Lived in Tewksbury. Knew some of the kids who went to the high school. A witness claimed they saw Kozinski near Main Street that Saturday night, but the timeline didn't line up. He was questioned twice. Denied everything. His parents provided an alibi, said he was home by 9 p.m. Police didn't believe them, but couldn't prove otherwise. Walter Shelby, 34, a janitor at Tewksbury Memorial High, quiet guy, never married, drove an old Chevy sedan. A few students said he creeped them out, though nobody could point to anything specific. Detectives questioned him extensively. He admitted he knew who John was, recognized him from school, but said he didn't work Saturdays and wasn't near the school that weekend. Alibi checked out. They moved on. Then there were the drifters, transients passing through town, guys with no fixed address, no ties to the community, easy to suspect, impossible to track. Dozens of tips came in. Anonymous calls, letters, people reporting suspicious behavior from neighbors they didn't like. Most of it went nowhere. Thornton interviewed John's parents 4 times in the first 2 weeks. It was standard procedure. Family members are always looked at first. Statistically, most victims know their killer. But Robert and Patricia McCabe weren't suspects. Not really. Anyone who saw them could tell. The grief was too raw, too real. Still, Thornton had to ask the hard questions. Did John have any enemies? Anyone who'd threatened him? No. Was he involved in anything dangerous? Drugs? Gangs? Absolutely not. Had he seemed scared recently? Worried about anything? No. He was normal. Happy, even. Had there been anyone hanging around the house? Following him? Not that they'd noticed. Robert McCabe kept asking the same question over and over. Who would do this? Thornton didn't have an answer. By October, the leads were drying up. Detectives had followed every thread they could find. Re-interviewed witnesses, checked and rechecked alibis, sent evidence to the state crime lab. Nothing stuck. Whoever killed John Robert McCabe had either been incredibly lucky or incredibly careful. The case wasn't officially closed. Cold cases never are, but resources were finite. Other crimes demanded attention. The task force was scaled back. Thornton kept working it when he could, but the trail had gone ice cold. The McCabe family held out hope. For months, then years. But hope is a hard thing to sustain when every lead evaporates. When every phone call from the police is just an update that says nothing new. By 1970, the investigation had stalled. By 1975, it was a file in a box. By 1980, most people in Tewksbury had moved on. But John's family never did. And neither did the detectives who inherited the case in the decades that followed. Because some murders don't let go, some names don't fade, and some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually claw their way back to the surface. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just makes them quieter. For the McCabe family, the years after John's murder weren't about moving on. They were about learning to live in a world that had moved on without them. A world where their son's death became old news, then a cold case, then a footnote in Tewksbury's history. But for Robert and Patricia McCabe, September 21st, 1969, never became history. It stayed present. Every morning. Every holiday. Every time they passed his empty bedroom. Patricia didn't change a single thing in John's room. The bed stayed made. The posters on the wall bands she never understood stayed up. His clothes hung in the closet. The books on his shelf collected dust. The transistor radio sat silent on the nightstand. She'd go in there sometimes, sit on the edge of his bed, run her hand over the blanket, talk to him like he was still 15, still coming home. Robert Sr. couldn't go in that room. Not once. Not ever. He went back to work 2 weeks after the funeral. What else was he supposed to do? Sit at home and shatter? The textile mill didn't care about grief. Bills didn't stop. Life kept dragging forward whether you were ready or not. He picked up extra shifts, worked doubles, weekends, anything to stay busy. Anything to keep his mind from circling back to the same question over and over. Who took my son? The detectives called every few months in the beginning. Updates that weren't really updates. We're still working on it. We haven't forgotten. We're following up on a few leads, but leads dried up. Witnesses moved away or stopped returning calls. Suspects were cleared. Evidence sat in boxes with no new technology to test it. By 1973, the calls stopped coming. The case wasn't officially closed. Cold cases never are, but it wasn't active either. It was a file in a cabinet, a name on a list. One of dozens of unsolved murders from the 60 seconds that no one had time to revisit. John's older brother, Daniel, left town in 1972. He couldn't take it anymore. Couldn't walk past the high school without seeing his brother's ghost. Couldn't go to the grocery store without people staring. The looks, the whispers, the pity. He moved to New Hampshire, got a job in construction, met a woman, got married, had kids. He loved his parents, called them once a week, visited twice a year. But Tewksbury felt like a graveyard, and he couldn't live in one. Margaret, John's younger sister, was 12 when he died. She didn't understand it. Not really. Just that her brother went to a dance and never came home, and now her parents cried all the time and the house felt like a tomb. She grew up angry. Angry at the police for not catching whoever did it, angry at God for letting it happen, angry at John for leaving her, angry at the world for moving on like nothing happened. By the time she was 16, she'd decided she wanted to be a detective, solve cases like her brothers, make sure families got answers. She took criminal justice classes at a community college in 1977. Lasted one semester. Turned out studying crime didn't give her closure. It just ripped the wound open wider. She dropped out, worked retail, bounced between jobs, never married, never had kids. She stayed in Tewksbury because leaving felt like abandoning John. Every September 21st, she visited his grave, brought flowers, sat in the grass, talked to a headstone. 44 years. She never missed once. In 1983, Detective Victor Lennox inherited the cold case files. He was new to the unit. Hungry. Idealistic. He pulled John McCabe's file in his first week and read every page, every witness statement, every dead-end lead, every heartbreaking interview with John's parents. Then he started over. He re-interviewed everyone still living in Tewksbury who'd been questioned in 1969. Some had moved, some had died. The ones still around remembered the case, but their memories had dulled. Details had blurred. Gerald Foss, the man who'd reported seeing a scuffle near Main and Foster the night John disappeared, now wasn't sure it happened that night. Maybe it was a different Saturday. Maybe he imagined it. He apologized, said he wished he could help. Lennox tracked down Leonard Marsh, the man who lived near the dump site. He was 57 now, still living in the same house, still drinking, still alone. Lennox questioned him again. Marsh gave the same answers. No. He didn't kill anyone. No. He didn't know anything. Yes. People thought he was creepy. No. He didn't care. There was nothing there. David Kaczynski, the teenager with the assault record back in '69, was now 33 and serving time in a Massachusetts state prison for armed robbery. Lennox drove out to see him. Kaczynski barely remembered being questioned about John McCabe. "I didn't kill nobody back then," he said flatly. "You're wasting your time." Lennox believed him. He spent 6 months on the case, submitted old evidence for retesting, but forensic science in the 80 seconds wasn't much better than the 60 seconds. No breakthroughs, no new leads. Eventually, the case went back into the cabinet. Lennox would pull it out 2 more times before he retired in 1998. Each time, he ran into the same brick wall. Patricia McCabe died in 1994. Heart attack. She was 68 years old. She never got answers, never saw justice, never got to look her son's killer in the eye. At her funeral, Margaret stood at the graveside and whispered a promise. "I won't stop, Johnny. I won't let them forget you." Robert Sr. lasted 5 more years. Died in 1999. Lung cancer. Years of mill work and cigarettes finally killed him. He was buried next to Patricia. Next to John. 3 headstones in a row. A family destroyed by one night in 1969. When the new century came, police departments across the country started digitizing cold case files, uploading reports, building databases, cross-referencing unsolved crimes with new DNA technology. In 2003, John McCabe's case was entered into the system. Detective Angela Ross reviewed it. She was young, ambitious. She believed every victim deserved justice, no matter how long it took. She requested DNA testing on the rope and duct tape that had been used to bind John. Maybe there was touch DNA, skin cells, something the detectives in 1969 couldn't detect. The results came back weeks later. Inconclusive. The evidence had degraded, been stored improperly. moved from room to room over the decades, exposed to heat, humidity, contamination. Whatever biological material might have been there was gone. Ross didn't quit. She tracked down Michael Gibbons, John's best friend, the one who'd been grounded the night of the murder. He was in his 50s now, owned a plumbing business in Lowell. Married, 3 kids, they met at a diner. Michael's hands trembled when he talked about John. "I think about him every September," Michael said quietly. "Wonder what kind of man he would have been, if he'd have kids, grandkids, if we'd still be friends." Ross asked if he remembered anything unusual in the days before John died. Michael thought hard, shook his head. Nothing. It was just a normal week, and then he was gone. Ross left her card, told him to call if anything came to mind. He never did. By 2010, the case was 41 years old. Most of the original detectives were dead. The witnesses were elderly or gone. Even some of the early suspects had passed away. Margaret McCabe was the last surviving immediate family member. She was 53. Still unmarried. Still living in Tewksbury. Still visiting John's grave every year. She called the police department every September 21st. Asked if there were any updates. The answer was always the same. "No, ma'am. But we haven't forgotten him." Kind words, empty words. Margaret knew they meant well. But not forgetting wasn't the same as solving. She'd spent her entire adult life in the shadow of her brother's murder. 40 years of carrying his name, his memory, his unfinished life. Some people told her to move on, let it go, find peace. But how do you find peace when the person who destroyed your family is still out there? Still breathing, still free? If this story is hitting you, go ahead and tap that like button right now. Cases like John's don't get solved by accident. They get solved because people refuse to forget. So, let's make sure his name stays alive. Hit like. It matters. And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how far John's story is reaching, because here's the truth about cold cases. They don't stay cold forever. Not when someone finally talks. Not when the right person hears the wrong thing at the right time. And in 2013, 44 years after John Robert McCabe was murdered, someone said something they shouldn't have. At a party, in front of the wrong person. And everything changed. It happened at a backyard barbecue in Lowell, Massachusetts. July 2013. Hot summer afternoon. Burgers on the grill. Cooler full of beer. 15, maybe 20 people standing around talking about nothing important. Work. The Red Sox. Whose kid was doing what? Nobody there expected that day to change anything. Especially not a 44-year-old murder case. There was a woman at the party named Joanna Bartlett. Mid-50s. Worked as a nurse at a hospital in Boston. Divorced. 2 grown kids. She'd been friends with the host. A former co-worker for years. Showed up with potato salad and stayed for a few hours. At some point in the afternoon, Joanna ended up in a conversation with a man she'd never met before. His name was Peter, friend of a friend. He was a little drunk. A little too talkative. The kind of guy who corners you at a party and won't let you leave. They were talking about Tewksbury. Joanna had grown up there. Moved away in the 80 seconds. Peter mentioned he had a cousin who used to live there back in the day. Real piece of work, Peter said, shaking his head. Guy's been in and out of trouble his whole life. Joanna nodded politely. Didn't really care. But then Peter kept going. You ever hear about that kid who got killed there? Back in the 60 seconds, tied up and strangled. Joanna froze. John McCabe, she said quietly. Yeah, everyone in Tewksbury knew about that. Peter took a sip of his beer. My cousin knew something about it. Joanna's heart started beating faster. What do you mean? He told me once years ago. We were drinking, he said he knew who did it. Said some guy he hung around with back then was involved. Never got caught. Joanna stared at him. Are you serious? Peter shrugged. That's what he said. I don't know if it was true. My cousin lies about a lot of shit. What's his name? Joanna asked. Why? Just tell me. Peter hesitated. Then he gave her a first name. Wouldn't say more. Got uncomfortable. Changed the subject. But Joanna didn't let it go. She left the party an hour later and sat in her car for 20 minutes, thinking. She could ignore it, pretend she never heard it, mind her own business, or she could make a phone call. She pulled out her phone and searched for Tewksbury Police Department. The call came into the station on a Tuesday morning. Detective Kevin Moran took it. He was 38, been with Tewksbury PD for 12 years. He'd heard about the McCabe case every cop in the department had, but it wasn't his. Belonged to the cold case unit, which basically meant it belonged to no one. Joanna explained what she'd heard at the party. The cousin, the claim about knowing who killed John McCabe, the name she'd managed to get. Moran listened, took notes, asked her to repeat certain details. When she finished, he thanked her and said someone would follow up. He hung up, stared at his notes. Then he walked down the hall to find Lieutenant Frank DeLuca, who oversaw cold cases. DeLuca was 56, 2 years from retirement. He'd been a cop for 33 years and had seen the McCabe file more times than he could count. Every few years, someone would call in with a tip, a name, a rumor, a hunch. 99% of them went nowhere, but you still had to follow up. You owed that to the family. Moran explained the call. DeLuca listened, arms crossed, face unreadable. When Moran finished, DeLuca was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Get me the file." Moran pulled the McCabe case file from storage. It was thick, decades of reports, interviews, dead ends, and disappointments all bound together in a worn folder. DeLuca spread it across his desk and started reading. He'd read it before, multiple times. But this time, he was looking for something specific. A name, the name Joanna Bartlett had given them. And he found it, buried in a witness statement from 1969. A teenager who'd been interviewed briefly after John's murder. Not a suspect, just someone who knew people in the area. Someone who'd been questioned and cleared. Someone whose name had been forgotten for over 40 years. Wayne Delaney. DeLuca sat back in his chair, stared at the page. Wayne Delaney had been 19 years old, in 1969, lived in Tewksbury, worked odd jobs, had a few minor run-ins with the law, vandalism, petty theft, nothing violent. Detectives had questioned him because he'd been seen near Main Street the night John disappeared. He said he didn't know anything, didn't see anything. They had no reason to hold him. Let him go, and that was it. His name appeared once in the file, then never again. Now, 44 years later, someone was saying Wayne Delaney knew who killed John McCabe. Maybe more than knew. Maybe was involved. DeLuca picked up the phone and called the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit. If they were going to reopen this, they needed resources. Manpower. Access to databases and technology that Tewksbury PD didn't have. Within a week, a joint task force was formed. Tewksbury PD, State Police, a forensic analyst from the State Crime Lab. Their mission: find Wayne Delaney and find out what he knew. Tracking him down took less than 2 days. Wayne Delaney was 63 years old, living in Billerica, about 15 minutes from Tewksbury. He'd spent most of his adult life moving between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Multiple arrests over the years: assault, drug possession, DUI. Served time in county jail, twice. Now he was on disability, living in a small apartment, mostly keeping to himself. Detectives knocked on his door on a Thursday afternoon. Delaney answered, looked older than 63. Thin, gray, weathered by decades of hard living. When they told him they wanted to talk about John McCabe, his face went pale. "I don't know nothing about that," he said immediately. "We're not accusing you of anything," DeLuca said calmly. "We just want to ask a few questions. I talked to the cops back then, told them everything I knew, which was nothing. Then this won't take long." Delaney hesitated. Then he stepped aside and let them in. They sat in his cramped living room, stacks of newspapers, dirty dishes, the smell of cigarettes and old carpet. DeLuca asked Delaney to walk them through the night of September 20th, 1969, where he was, who he was with, what he saw. Delaney gave the same story he'd given in 1969. He was out with friends, hanging around town, saw some kids heading to the Y for a dance, didn't pay much attention, went home around 10, didn't see John McCabe, didn't know him. "Ever hear anyone talk about what happened to him?" DeLuca asked. "No." "Ever hear any rumors? Theories?" "No." "You sure?" Delaney's jaw tightened. "I'm sure." DeLuca leaned forward. "We have a witness who says you told someone you knew who killed John McCabe." Delaney's eyes widened. "That's bullshit. They were pretty specific, Wayne." "I don't care. I didn't say that. Whoever told you that is lying." "Why would they lie?" "I don't know." But they are. The interview went in circles for another 20 minutes. Delaney stuck to his story, denied everything, got defensive, angry, finally told them to leave. DeLuca and Moran walked back to their car, sat in silence for a moment. "He's hiding something," Moran said. DeLuca nodded. "Yeah, but hiding what?" They ran Delaney's name through every database they had access to: phone records, financial records, known associates, cross-referenced names from the original 1,969 investigation, looked for connections, patterns, anything that might explain why Wayne Delaney would know who killed John McCabe. And then they found it. A name that appeared in Delaney's life in 1969. Someone he worked with. Someone he was seen with. Someone who, at the time, was never seriously considered as a suspect. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes and decades of hindsight, everything started to fit. Don't go anywhere. We're about to get into who that person was and what happened next. But first, comment below. What's the weather like where you are right now? Seriously, I want to know. Drop it in the comments, because what detectives uncovered next would blow the case wide open. And after 44 years of silence, the truth was finally about to surface. The name that kept appearing next to Wayne Delaney's in 1969 was Edward Ruggiero. He was 22 years old back then. Lived in Tewksbury. Worked construction with Delaney for a few months that summer. They weren't close friends, but they ran in the same circles, drank at the same bars, knew the same people. Ruggiero had been questioned once, during the original investigation. Briefly. His name came up because a witness saw him near Main Street on the night John disappeared. Detectives brought him in, asked him a few questions. He said he was out that night but didn't see anything unusual. Didn't know John McCabe. Had no reason to hurt anyone. They let him go. He wasn't a priority. There were other suspects who seemed more promising. Ruggiero faded into the background of the investigation and was never looked at again. Until now. Detective DeLuca pulled Ruggiero's file from the archives. It was thin. One interview, a few notes. That was it. But now, with Wayne Delaney's name resurfacing and the claim that he knew who killed John, DeLuca wanted to take another look at everyone Delaney associated with back then. Edward Ruggiero was 66 years old in 2013, still living in Massachusetts, married, 3 adult children, worked construction his whole life until retiring 5 years earlier. No major criminal record, a DUI in the 80 seconds, disorderly conduct charge in the 90 seconds that was dismissed. Nothing that screamed, murderer. But DeLuca had learned a long time ago that killers don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like everyone else. He started digging deeper, pulled Ruggiero's employment records from 1,969, cross-referenced them with witness statements, looked at where he lived, where he worked, who he knew, and something caught his attention. In September 1969, Ruggiero had been working on a construction site less than half a mile from the vacant lot where John's body was found. He would have known that area, would have known it was empty, secluded, a place where you could dump something, or someone, without being seen. DeLuca kept digging, requested phone records, financial records, anything that might show a connection between Ruggiero and John McCabe. There was nothing obvious, no prior relationship, no clear motive, but that didn't mean there wasn't one. He reached out to the state police forensic unit and asked them to re-examine every piece of physical evidence from the case: the rope, the duct tape, John's clothing, anything that had been stored and preserved over the decades. Technology had advanced. DNA testing in 2013 was light years beyond what existed in 1969. Maybe there was something they'd missed. The evidence was transported to the state crime lab in Sudbury. Forensic analyst Dr. Linda Brennan took charge of the review. She'd worked cold cases before, knew how fragile old evidence could be, how easily it could be contaminated or degraded, but she also knew that sometimes, just sometimes, you got lucky. She started with the rope used to bind John's wrists and ankles. It had been stored in a sealed evidence bag for 44 years. She examined it under a microscope, looked for touch DNA, skin cells, sweat, anything left behind by whoever tied those knots. The first round of testing came back inconclusive. Too much degradation, too much time. But Dr. Brennan didn't stop. She tried a different extraction method, a newer technique designed specifically for degraded samples, sent it through again. This time, she got a partial profile. Not enough for a definitive match, but enough to rule people out, enough to narrow the field. She ran the profile through CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. No hits. Whoever left that DNA wasn't in the system, which meant they'd either never been arrested for a serious crime, or they'd committed this murder before DNA collection became standard. DeLuca wasn't surprised. Most criminals in 1969 weren't in any database. Fingerprints, maybe, but not DNA. Still, it was progress. If they could get a sample from a suspect, they could compare it to the partial profile from the rope. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was something. DeLuca turned his attention back to Edward Ruggiero. He needed more than circumstantial connections. He needed evidence, witnesses, something that would hold up in court. He started re-interviewing people from 1,969 who were still alive. Old co-workers of Ruggiero's, people who lived in Tewksbury back then, anyone who might remember something, anything that seemed insignificant at the time but mattered now. Most of them didn't remember much. 44 years is a long time. Memories fade, details blur, but a few people remembered Edward Ruggiero, described him as rough, hot-tempered, the kind of guy who got into bar fights, who didn't back down, who had a mean streak when he drank. One man, a former co-worker named Bill Sanderson, told DeLuca something interesting. He said that in the weeks after John McCabe's murder, Ruggiero had been acting weird, quieter than usual, nervous, stopped coming to work for a few days. When Sanderson asked him what was wrong, Ruggiero snapped at him, told him to mind his own business. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Sanderson said. "Figured he was just having a bad week. But looking back now, I don't know. Something was off. It wasn't proof. But it was a thread, and DeLuca pulled on it. He went back to Wayne Delaney, knocked on his door again. This time, Delaney looked even more uncomfortable. "We need to talk about Edward Ruggiero," DeLuca said. Delaney's face went white. "I got nothing to say. Wayne, if you know something, now's the time to tell us. Because if this goes where I think it's going, you don't want to be on the wrong side of it." Delaney stared at him. His hands were shaking. "I could lose everything," he said quietly. "You could lose more if you don't talk." There was a long silence. Then Delaney exhaled slowly and stepped aside. "Let them in." This time, he told a different story. He said that in the fall of 1969, Edward Ruggiero had shown up at his apartment late one night, drunk, agitated, rambling about something bad that happened. Delaney didn't press him for details, didn't want to know. But Ruggiero kept talking, said he'd messed up, said someone had died, said it was an accident, but nobody would believe that. Delaney told him to leave, told him to never talk about it again, and for 44 years, he didn't. "Why didn't you go to the police back then?" DeLuca asked. Delaney looked down. "Because I was scared. And because I didn't want to believe it was true. I convinced myself he was just drunk, just talking shit. But deep down, I knew." "Knew what?" "That he killed that kid." DeLuca felt his pulse quicken. "Did he say John McCabe's name?" "No, but I read about it in the paper a few days later. Saw the kid's picture, and I knew. I just knew." "Why are you telling us this now?" Delaney looked up. His eyes were red. "Because I'm 63 years old and I'm tired of carrying it, and because that kid's family deserves to know." DeLuca left Delaney's apartment with the first real break in the case in over 4 decades. A witness, a confession second-hand, but still a confession. Combined with the forensic evidence, the timeline, the connections, it was enough to move forward. But they still needed more. They needed Edward Ruggiero's DNA. They needed to place him at the scene. They needed something definitive. DeLuca contacted the district attorney's office, laid out everything they had. The DA agreed it was worth pursuing but cautioned that a 44-year-old case would be difficult to prosecute. Memories fade, witnesses die, evidence degrades, juries expect certainty, and cold cases rarely offer that. But DeLuca wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when they were this close. The DA authorized surveillance on Edward Ruggiero. Detectives followed him for 2 weeks, documented his movements, waited for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample legally. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. Ruggiero stopped at a coffee shop in Billerica, bought a large iced coffee, sat outside at a table, drank it, then tossed the cup in the trash and walked away. Detectives waited until he was gone. retrieved the cup, bagged it as evidence. The DNA sample was sent to the lab. Dr. Brennan extracted saliva from the rim of the cup, processed it, compared it to the partial profile from the rope that had been used to bind John McCabe's wrists. The results came back 3 weeks later. It was a match. Not perfect, the sample from the rope was too degraded for that, but enough markers aligned that the statistical probability was overwhelming. The DNA on that rope belonged to Edward Ruggiero. After 44 years, they finally had him. DeLuca called Margaret McCabe, told her they'd identified a suspect, told her they were moving forward with an arrest. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she whispered, "Thank you." On November 14, 2013, detectives arrived at Edward Ruggiero's home with an arrest warrant. He answered the door in a bathrobe, looked confused. Then he saw the badges, the uniforms, and his face changed. He knew. "Edward Ruggiero, you're under arrest for the murder of John Robert McCabe." They cuffed him, read him his rights, walked him to the patrol car while neighbors stared from their windows. Ruggiero didn't say a word. Not then. Not in the car. Not at the station. He just sat in the interrogation room, hands folded, staring at the table. After 44 years of silence, John McCabe's killer finally had a name, and the community that had waited decades for answers was about to learn the truth. Edward James Ruggiero was born in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1947, second of 4 children. Father worked at a shoe factory. Mother stayed home. They weren't rich, but they weren't poor either. Standard working-class family in a working-class town. Eddie, as people called him back then, was an average student, played baseball in high school, dropped out senior year, started working construction at 18. Strong kid, good with his hands. The kind of labor that didn't require a diploma. By 1969, he was 22 years old, living in a rented room in Tewksbury, working odd construction jobs around the area, drinking too much, getting into fights, the kind of young man who was always one bad decision away from serious trouble. People who knew him back then described him the same way. Angry, volatile, the kind of guy who'd start a fight over nothing and wouldn't stop until someone pulled him off. He'd been arrested twice before John McCabe's murder, once for assault outside a bar in Lowell, once for vandalism. Both charges were dropped or pleaded down. He spent a weekend in jail, paid a fine, walked away. By the time detectives looked at him in 1969, he wasn't considered a serious suspect. He had no known connection to John McCabe, no clear motive. And when they questioned him, he seemed calm, cooperative, said he didn't know anything. They moved on. But now, 44 years later, everything looked different. DeLuca and his team spent weeks building a profile of Edward Ruggiero, not just who he was in 2013, but who he'd been in 1969, what his life looked like, where he went, who he knew, what might have driven him to kill a 15-year-old boy. They found court records, employment records, interviewed people who'd known him back then, built a timeline of his movements in the weeks before and after John's murder, and a picture started to emerge. In September 1969, Ruggiero had been fired from a construction job, got into an argument with his foreman, shoved the guy, was told not to come back. He'd been struggling financially, behind on rent, drinking heavily. Friends said he was on edge, looking for trouble. On the night of September 20th, 1969, multiple witnesses now recalled seeing Ruggiero in downtown Tewksbury, near Main Street. Around the same time, John McCabe was walking to the YMCA. One witness, a woman named Dolores Finch, who hadn't been interviewed in the original investigation, came forward in 2013 after hearing about the arrest. She said she'd seen Ruggiero that night, sitting in his car on a side street off Main, engine running, just sitting there. She remembered because it seemed strange, like he was waiting for someone. Another witness, a man named Greg Holloway, remembered seeing Ruggiero's car parked near the vacant lot on Dover Street later that night. He'd driven past it around 10:30 p.m. Didn't think anything of it at the time. Forgotten about it until detectives came knocking 44 years later. Piece by piece, the timeline was coming together. Ruggiero was in the area when John disappeared. His car was seen near the dump site, and according to Wayne Delaney, Ruggiero had confessed drunk and panicked just days after the murder. But the question everyone kept asking was, why? Why would a 22-year-old construction worker kill a 15-year-old kid he didn't even know? DeLuca had a theory. It wasn't confirmed, probably never would be, but based on the evidence, the witness statements, and Ruggiero's history, it made sense. Ruggiero was angry that night, unemployed, broke, drunk, looking for a target, and John McCabe, young, innocent, walking alone, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe Ruggiero tried to rob him. Maybe John resisted. Maybe it escalated. Or maybe, and this was darker, Ruggiero just wanted to hurt someone, wanted to feel powerful, wanted to take out his rage on someone weaker. They'd never know for sure unless Ruggiero talked, and so far, he hadn't said a word. After his arrest, Ruggiero was booked into Middlesex County Jail, held without bail. His family was in shock. His wife of 38 years told reporters she didn't believe it, said her husband wasn't capable of something like that, said the police had the wrong man. His children refused to comment. Friends stayed silent. Nobody wanted to be associated with a child killer. The news broke on November 15, 2013. Local stations picked it up first, then regional papers, then national outlets. Massachusetts cold case solved after 44 years. DNA evidence leads to arrest in 1969. Murder of teen. The town of Tewksbury was stunned. Some people remembered the case. Older residents who'd been around in 1969. They remembered the fear, the rumors, the way the town had changed after John's death. Younger residents had heard about it vaguely. A murder from decades ago, a cold case that never got solved. But it had always felt like ancient history, until now. Margaret McCabe didn't speak to the press right away. She couldn't. For 44 years, she'd waited for this moment, prayed for it, and now that it was here, she didn't know what to feel. Relief? Anger? Grief all over again? She visited John's grave the day after the arrest, sat in the grass, told him they'd finally caught the man who killed him, told him she was sorry it took so long, told him she loved him. Then she went home and cried for 3 hours. People started coming forward with memories of Edward Ruggiero, old co-workers, neighbors, people who'd crossed paths with him over the years. Most of them said the same thing. He was always angry, always looking for a fight, the kind of man you avoided if you could. One woman, who'd lived next door to Ruggiero in the early 72nd, said she'd always been afraid of him. Said he used to yell at his girlfriend, punch walls, throw things. She'd called the police twice. Nothing came of it. "I'm not surprised he did this," she said. "I'm surprised it took this long to catch him." Ruggiero's public defender tried to get the charges dropped, argued that the evidence was too old, that memories from 1969 couldn't be trusted, that the DNA was inconclusive, that this was a rush to judgment based on circumstantial evidence and a 44-year-old hearsay confession. The judge disagreed, ruled that the case could move forward. Prosecutors were confident. They had DNA. They had a witness who'd heard Ruggiero confess. They had a timeline that placed him near the crime scene. They had motive, means, and opportunity. But they also knew this wouldn't be easy. 44 years was a long time. Witnesses were old. Memories were unreliable. And juries in cold cases always had doubts. Still, they were moving forward. For John, for his family, for every victim whose case had gone cold and been forgotten. The preliminary hearing was set for January 2014. Ruggiero would enter a plea. Prosecutors would present their case, and the legal battle would officially begin. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, DeLuca kept working, kept digging, kept looking for anything that might strengthen the case. He re-interviewed Wayne Delaney, made sure his story was consistent, made sure he was willing to testify. Delaney was terrified. He knew what it meant to go on the stand, knew what it would cost him, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. "That kid deserves justice," Delaney said, "even if it's 44 years late." DeLuca also reached out to forensic experts, asked them to review the DNA evidence, make sure it would hold up under cross-examination. They assured him it would. The match wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough. Combined with everything else, it painted a clear picture. Edward Ruggiero killed John Robert McCabe on September 20th, 1969, tied him up, strangled him, dumped his body in a vacant lot, then went on living his life like nothing happened, got married, had kids, worked, retired, sat in his living room watching TV while John's family spent 44 years wondering who took their son. But now the truth was out, and Ruggiero would finally face what he'd done. The community processed the news in different ways. Some people felt relief. Finally, an answer. Finally, justice. Others felt anger. Why did it take so long? Why didn't anyone catch him back then? And some felt sadness. Because even with an arrest, John McCabe was still gone. His parents were dead. His childhood was stolen. And no trial, no conviction, no sentence would ever bring him back. Don't go anywhere, we're about to get into what happened in that courtroom. But first, comment below. What's the weather like where you are? Seriously, drop it in the comments. I want to know who's following this story. Because what happened next, the legal battle, the testimony, the final reckoning, would determine whether 44 years of waiting had been worth it. The preliminary hearing took place on January 23, 2014, at Middlesex Superior Court in Woburn, Massachusetts. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, local residents, members of John's extended family, people who remembered 1,969, people who'd never heard of the case until the arrest. Margaret McCabe sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. Edward Ruggiero entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed in front of him, gray hair, thick glasses. He looked like somebody's grandfather, not a killer. That's what his defense attorney was counting on. His lawyer, Thomas Brennan, was a veteran public defender. He'd handled dozens of murder cases. He knew how to create reasonable doubt. And in a case this old, doubt wasn't hard to find. Judge Patricia Donnelly presided. She'd been on the bench for 18 years, seen everything. She looked over the case file with the same careful attention she gave every case, regardless of how old it was. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Lauren Mitchell. She was 41, sharp, relentless. She'd prosecuted cold cases before and knew the challenges: old evidence, faded memories, witnesses who couldn't remember what they had for breakfast yesterday, let alone what they saw 44 years ago. But she also knew that justice didn't have an expiration date. Ruggiero entered a plea of not guilty. His voice was quiet, steady. He looked directly at the judge when he said it. Didn't look at Margaret McCabe, didn't look at anyone else. Brennan immediately filed motions to suppress evidence, argued that the DNA sample taken from the coffee cup was obtained improperly, that his client had a reasonable expectation of privacy, even in a public trash can, that the collection violated his Fourth Amendment rights. Judge Donnelly denied the motion, ruled that once Ruggiero discarded the cup in a public space, he had no reasonable expectation of privacy. The DNA collection was legal. Brennan also moved to exclude Wayne Delaney's testimony, argued that it was hearsay, that a drunken confession from 44 years ago, recalled by a man with a criminal record, was unreliable, that allowing it would be prejudicial. The judge reserved judgment on that one, said she'd rule after hearing more evidence. The case moved to trial. Jury selection began in March 2014. It took 2 weeks to seat 12 jurors and 2 alternates. The defense wanted people who'd question old evidence. The prosecution wanted people who believed in justice, no matter how long it took. The trial began on April 7, 2014. Mitchell's opening statement was powerful. She stood in front of the jury and told them John's story. Not just the murder. The life. The boy who wanted to go to a dance. The family that waited 44 years for answers. The investigation that never stopped. This case is about patience, Mitchell said. About detectives who refused to give up. About evidence that stood the test of time. And about a man who thought he'd gotten away with murder. She walked them through the evidence. The DNA. The timeline. The witnesses. Wayne Delaney's testimony. The fact that Ruggiero was in the area that night. That his car was seen near the dump site. That he'd confessed to a friend just days after the murder. Edward Ruggiero killed John Robert McCabe on September 20th, 1969, Mitchell said. And after 44 years, he's finally going to answer for it. Brennan's opening was different. He painted Ruggiero as a scapegoat. A man being blamed for a decades-old crime because the police needed to close the case. He attacked the DNA evidence, called it degraded, inconclusive, said the partial match could belong to dozens of people. He attacked Wayne Delaney's credibility, called him a lifelong criminal with a history of lying, said his testimony was worthless. This case is built on guesses, Brennan said. Old memories, contaminated evidence, a desperate attempt to solve a case that should have been solved in 1969. My client is innocent, and by the end of this trial, you'll see that the state hasn't proven otherwise. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks. They called Detective DeLuca to the stand. He walked the jury through the investigation, how the case had gone cold, how the tip from Joanna Bartlett reopened it, how they'd tracked down Wayne Delaney, how the evidence pointed to Edward Ruggiero. Brennan cross-examined him hard, pressed him on why Ruggiero wasn't a serious suspect in 1969, why it took 44 years to arrest him, whether the police were just looking for someone to blame. DeLuca held his ground. "We followed the evidence," he said calmly, "wherever it led. And it led to your client." Dr. Linda Brennan, the forensic analyst, testified about the DNA, explained how touch DNA works, how degraded samples can still provide useful profiles, how the DNA from the rope matched Edward Ruggiero's DNA within a statistical probability that made it nearly certain. Brennan, the defense attorney, not the forensic analyst, challenged every word, asked about contamination, about false positives, about the limitations of partial matches. Dr. Brennan answered every question with patience and precision. The DNA evidence held. Then came Wayne Delaney. He took the stand on the 8th day of trial, looked older than his 64 years, nervous, hands shaking. But his story was consistent. He told the jury what Ruggiero had said to him in the fall of 1969, about messing up, about someone dying, about it being an accident, but nobody would believe him. "Did the defendant specifically say he killed John McCabe?" Mitchell asked. "No," Delaney admitted. "He didn't say the name, but I put it together. Read about it in the paper a few days later. Knew it was him. Why didn't you go to the police?" "I was scared, and I didn't want to believe my friend could do something like that." "Do you believe it now?" Delaney looked at Ruggiero, held his gaze. "Yeah, I believe it." Brennan tore into him on cross-examination, brought up his criminal record, his history with drugs and alcohol, asked how anyone could trust the memory of a conversation from 44 years ago, especially when he'd been drinking at the time. Delaney held firm. "I remember it because it's the kind of thing you don't forget, even when you want to." The defense called only 2 witnesses, a forensic expert who questioned the DNA evidence, said partial matches weren't reliable, that contamination was possible, that the state was overstating the certainty. Mitchell dismantled him on cross, got him to admit that the statistical probability was still strong, that even degraded DNA could be useful, that the match, combined with everything else, was significant. The second witness was Ruggiero's wife. She testified that her husband was a good man, a good father, that he'd never been violent with her or the kids, that he couldn't have done this. But on cross-examination, Mitchell asked her a simple question. "Where was your husband on the night of September 20th, 1969? She blinked. "I don't know. We weren't together then." "So you have no idea where he was that night?" "No." "Then how can you say he didn't do this?" She didn't have an answer. Edward Ruggiero did not testify. Brennan advised against it. Too risky. The prosecution would destroy him. Closing arguments came in late April. Mitchell reminded the jury of everything they'd heard. The DNA, the timeline, the confession to Wayne Delaney, the fact that Ruggiero had no alibi, that he was in the area, that his car was seen near the dump site. "This isn't a perfect case," she admitted. 44 years is a long time, but the evidence is clear. Edward Ruggiero killed John Robert McCabe, and it's time long past time that he faces justice. Brennan argued reasonable doubt. Said the state hadn't proven its case beyond that standard. That old evidence and old memories weren't enough to convict a man of murder. "You can't guess someone into prison," he said, "and that's what the state is asking you to do. Guess. My client deserves better than that. So does the justice system." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On May 2nd, 2014, they returned a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. Margaret McCabe collapsed in her seat, sobbed. For the first time in 44 years, someone was being held accountable for her brother's death. Edward Ruggiero showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead. Sentencing was set for June. The sentencing hearing took place on June 19, 2014. Edward Ruggiero was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs. Same orange jumpsuit, same blank expression. He'd been in jail for 7 months, waiting. The guilty verdict hadn't broken him. Or maybe it had and he just refused to show it. Judge Donnelly asked if anyone wished to speak before sentencing. Margaret McCabe stood up. She was 57 years old, had waited her entire adult life for this moment. She walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, stood at the podium, looked directly at Edward Ruggiero. Her voice shook at first, then it steadied. "My brother was 15 years old when you killed him," she said. "He was excited about a dance, about seeing his friends, about being a normal teenager on a Saturday night. You took that from him. You took everything from him." Ruggiero didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the table. "My parents died without knowing who killed their son," Margaret continued. "They spent decades wondering, hoping, praying someone would give them answers. They never got them. You made sure of that. You stayed quiet. You went on with your life, got married, had children, grew old, while my brother stayed 15 forever." Her voice cracked. She paused, took a breath. "I don't know if you feel any guilt. I don't know if you ever think about what you did, but I hope you do. I hope every day, for the rest of your life, you think about the boy you killed, the family you destroyed, the 44 years we spent waiting for justice." She stepped back, sat down, wiped her eyes. Judge Donnelly asked if the defendant wished to speak. Ruggiero's attorney whispered something to him. Ruggiero shook his head, said nothing. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then she spoke. "Mr. Ruggiero, a jury of your peers has found you guilty of the murder of John Robert McCabe. This was not a heat-of-the-moment crime. This was not an accident. You bound a 15-year-old boy. You strangled him. You left his body in a vacant lot like he was nothing. And then you lived your life for 44 years, without once coming forward, without once taking responsibility." She paused, let the words hang in the air. "This court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down. Ruggiero was led out of the courtroom. He didn't look back, didn't say goodbye to his wife or his children, just walked out in handcuffs and disappeared behind the door. Margaret McCabe stayed in her seat for a long time after everyone else had left, just sitting, staring at the empty space where Ruggiero had been. Finally, she stood, walked out into the sunlight, and for the first time in 44 years, she felt like she could breathe. The news spread quickly. Life sentence for the man who killed John McCabe. Justice after more than 4 decades. Local news stations covered it. National outlets picked it up. The story went viral online. People who'd never heard of John McCabe now knew his name. In Tewksbury, reactions were mixed. Relief, anger, sadness. Some people felt vindicated. They'd always believed the case would be solved. Others felt frustrated that it took so long, that John's parents never got to see justice. "Better late than never," one longtime resident told a reporter. But it shouldn't have taken 44 years. Detective DeLuca gave a press conference the day after sentencing, stood in front of microphones and cameras, and talked about the case, about the investigation, about what it meant to finally close a file that had been open for nearly half a century. "This case proves that we never give up," DeLuca said. "No matter how much time passes, no matter how cold the trail gets, every victim deserves justice. And sometimes, if you're persistent enough, you get it." A reporter asked if he believed there were other cases like this, other killers who'd gotten away with murder decades ago and were still out there. "Absolutely," DeLuca said. "But cases like this give us hope. Technology improves. Witnesses come forward. People's consciences catch up with them. It's never too late." Margaret McCabe didn't do many interviews. She gave one statement to the local paper, thanking the detectives who never stopped working, thanking Joanna Bartlett for making that phone call, thanking Wayne Delaney for finally telling the truth. "I don't know if this is closure," she said. "I don't know if there is such a thing, but it's something. It's an answer. And after 44 years, that's more than I ever thought I'd get." She visited John's grave a few days after the sentencing, brought flowers, told him it was over, told him the man who killed him would die in prison, told him she was sorry it took so long. Then she went home and started the process of figuring out what came next. For 44 years, her life had been defined by her brother's unsolved murder. Now it was solved, and she didn't know who she was without that weight. Other cold case families reached out to her, people whose loved ones had been killed, and the cases had gone cold. They wanted to know how she survived the wait, how she kept hope alive, whether solving the case really helped. She told them the truth. It helped, But it didn't heal. John was still gone. Her parents were still dead. 44 years were still lost. But knowing the truth mattered. Knowing someone was held accountable mattered. Even if it came too late. Law enforcement agencies across the country took notice. The McCabe case became a teaching tool, an example of how cold cases could be solved with persistence, modern technology, and a little bit of luck. Training seminars used it as a case study. Police departments started re-examining their own cold cases with fresh eyes. Advances in DNA technology gave investigators new tools. Old evidence was retested, new databases were built, and slowly, other cases started to crack open. In 2015, a cold case from 1978 was solved in Vermont using similar methods. In 2016, a murder from 1983 inches, Rhode Island. In 2017, 3 more cases across Massachusetts. The ripple effect of John McCabe's case was real, but for Margaret, the broader implications didn't matter as much as the personal ones. Her brother's killer was in prison. That was enough. Edward Ruggiero was sent to YMCA Cedar Junction, a maximum security prison in Walpole, Massachusetts. He became inmate number 58392. Lost his name, lost his freedom, lost everything. His family stopped visiting after the first year. His wife filed for divorce in 2016. His children cut off contact. He was alone. In prison, Ruggiero kept to himself, didn't talk about the case, didn't admit guilt, didn't express remorse. Other inmates knew what he was in, for child killer. That label followed him everywhere, made him a target. He spent most of his time in his cell, reading, watching TV, waiting to die. In interviews years later, people who knew Ruggiero before his arrest said they weren't surprised. He always had a darkness in him. One former coworker said, "You could see it if you looked close enough. But most people don't look close enough. Most people see what they want to see." And for 44 years, Edward Ruggiero looked like everyone else. A working man, a husband, a father, someone you'd pass on the street and never think twice about. That's the scariest part. Killers don't always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like us. John McCabe's case changed Tewksbury, not in obvious ways, but in small ones. Parents held their kids a little tighter. People paid more attention. The innocence that died in 1969 never fully came back. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not just the boy who was killed, but the sense of safety that was lost with him. Still, there was something meaningful about finally getting answers, about proving that time doesn't erase accountability, that justice, even when delayed, still matters. Margaret McCabe said it best in an interview 5 years after the conviction. John's story didn't end the night he was killed. It ended the day his killer was held accountable. That's the difference between a cold case and a closed case. One is a question mark, the other is a period. We finally got our period. 44 years is more than half a lifetime. It's long enough for a child to grow up, have children of their own, and watch those children become adults. It's long enough for technology to evolve, from rotary phones to smartphones, long enough for the world to change in ways nobody in 1969 could have imagined. But for some things, time doesn't matter. Truth doesn't have an expiration date. Justice doesn't get old. And the weight of an unanswered question doesn't get lighter, just because decades pass. John Robert McCabe's case proves that. He was 15 years old when he died, excited about a dance, thinking about a girl he wanted to talk to, wearing his best shirt because he wanted to make a good impression. He was just a kid, a normal, ordinary kid who deserved to grow up. Edward Ruggiero took that from him, took his future, took his family's peace, took the sense of safety that Tewksbury once had, and for 44 years, he walked free, lived his life, pretended it never happened. But it did happen. And eventually, the truth caught up. That's what cold cases teach us. They teach us that secrets don't stay buried forever, that someone always knows something, that guilt has a way of surfacing, even decades later. One conversation at a party, one phone call from a concerned citizen, one detective who refuses to let a file collect dust. That's all it takes. The McCabe case also teaches us about the cost of silence. Wayne Delaney knew something in 1969. He heard Edward Ruggiero confess, and he stayed quiet for 44 years. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he didn't want to believe his friend was capable of murder. Maybe he convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility. But silence protects the guilty. And every year that passed without Delaney speaking up was another year John's family lived without answers. Another year, Edward Ruggiero lived without consequences. When Delaney finally came forward, he said he was tired of carrying it, tired of the weight. And that's the thing about truth, it's heavy. But lies are heavier. And eventually, they crush you. There are lessons here for all of us. If you know something, say something, even if it's years later, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you're not sure it matters, because it might. It might be the piece that solves the puzzle, the thread that unravels the lie, the key that unlocks justice. John's story also reminds us why cold case units matter, why funding matters, why investigators who care enough to dig through decades-old files matter. Detective DeLuca didn't have to reopen this case. It wasn't assigned to him. It wasn't going to help his career. But he did it anyway, because John deserved it, because Margaret deserved it, because justice mattered more than convenience. We live in a world that moves fast. New crimes happen every day. New headlines replace old ones. It's easy to forget, easy to move on. But the families of victims don't get to move on. They're stuck in the worst moment of their lives, waiting for someone to care enough to keep looking. Margaret McCabe waited 44 years. Her parents waited until they died. That's the real tragedy. Not just the murder, but the decades of not knowing, the decades of wondering if anyone still cared, if anyone was still trying. But they were. And eventually, they got him. John Robert McCabe's name is no longer just a cold case file. It's a story of persistence, of justice delayed but not denied, of a community that never fully forgot, of a sister who refused to let her brother's memory fade. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. Don't forget. Don't let cases like this disappear into the past. Don't let victims become statistics. Keep their names alive. Keep asking questions. Keep demanding answers. Because 44 years is a long time. But it's not too long for justice. If this case moved you, share this video right now. Someone else needs to hear John's story. Someone else needs to know that cold cases can be solved, that families can get answers, that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for. And subscribe, we're covering more cases that deserve to be told, cases that need people like you to keep them alive. What's one thing that stuck with you about this case? Was it the 44-year wait? The party conversation that changed everything? Margaret's strength? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. John Robert McCabe was 15 years old when he died. He wanted to go to a dance. He never made it. But today, his story lives on. His name is remembered, and the man who killed him is in prison for the rest of his life. That's not the ending John deserved, but it's the ending his family fought 44 years to get, and it matters